I was asked to comment on an article from the Washington Examiner basically stating that slavery doomed limited government in America. Well, let's ponder this next on the Constitution Study.
There's one thing you have to know wherever you make your stand. Came from a long through line of everyday Americans.
Hello there, everyday Americans. Paul Engel here once again with the Constitution Study. Yeah, that's right. This is where we read and study the Constitution and teach the rising generation to be free. As always, for more information, head over to the website, constitutionstudy.com. You'll find out where I'm going. You'll get access to all the web articles, the videos, the audio, all the content that I produce. Hopefully soon you'll see information about purchasing the book, which I hope will be out shortly. Still working on that. But most of all, it's where we can comment and discuss on topics and ideas, and that's kind of what I want to do here today. So head over, see where I'm speaking, invite me to come to one of your events. Most of all, let's share this information with others. It's important that we not keep this to ourselves, that this idea of understanding liberty, understanding our rights, understanding how they are defended, how they're protected, how we can defend them, how we can assert them, and do so legitimately is important if America is to remain free. I'll put a link in the description, but I do kind of understand the point that the writer was making. See, it seems to be it was the Reconstruction Amendments, the amendments to the Constitution, especially the 14th Amendment, after defeating slavery in the Civil War, that really has led to this expansion of government that makes you wonder, is limited government even possible anymore? But I think the writer makes one important mistake, and there's it's understanding the difference between correlation and causation. Yes, the expansion of government grew dramatically after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The idea that the federal government could get much more involved in what the states were doing. But is that really the cause, or is that just a correlation? So let's back up for just a second and set the stage. In America, when we were formed, there were several states that wanted to outlaw slavery. There were several states that wanted to keep slavery as a compromise. There were several compromises put into the Constitution that allowed slavery to remain. And it was the belief of many of our founders that slavery would die out in a generation or two, just because it would become unworkable. But as often happens, that isn't how it worked out. So then we had a civil war, a fight between states, and there's interesting, I hear this all the time. Some people say the Civil War was fought because of slavery. Some people say it was fought because of states' rights. In what history I've read, they're both kind of true. Yes, the Confederate States were trying to exercise their own sovereignty, but the only thing they were concerned about was their sovereignty to continue slavery. Be that as it may, they lost. The Union won, and now we have a state where, in the United States of America, slavery is outlawed. Well, big surprise, people didn't like that. People who had owned slaves, people whose livelihood depended on slavery, didn't like that. So they tried to find ways around the law. They tried to find ways to keep the idea of a sub-race, of a lesser race in the government processes. We end up with things like Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, and other things meant to keep a race of people down because they got away with not being slaves anymore. Now, the other states thought this was really bad, and they wrote several amendments to curtail that, to say, no, states cannot curtail the rights of citizens because of their race. If you're a citizen, you get all the rights and privileges, all the privileges and immunities. That's the term, the Privileges and Immunities Clause. You cannot violate the rights of a citizen. You cannot keep them from their rights, their privileges, or their immunities. And this is where I believe the author of the article is pointing as, is because we needed the federal government to tell the states what they could not do to infringe on people's rights. That's where limited government was lost. And I will admit, if you look at the state of the federal government, it started growing much rapidly after that point. Because now the federal government had reasons to look at the elections of certain states. They appointed themselves overseer of the elections of many states. They saw them as overseers of state law. They began to really kind of exercise more authority over the states, but still within that limited concept of we are ensuring the rights of citizens of the United States. But if we back up just a little bit, if we look at the lens of history, what do we see? You see, in the 1910s, we see lots of new laws and new regulations, and in fact, new constitutional amendments granting even more power to the federal government. You have the 16th Amendment, the 17th Amendment, right? Income tax, popular election senators granting more power. You have the prohibition and the repeal of prohibition. You see the federal government really exercising more power because the states are giving it more power. So yeah, there was an increase through Reconstruction, but there was another steeper increase through their like 1910, 1920s. But then let's look at the 1960s. See, in the 1910s and 1920s, the governments in the states still understood the Constitution restrained the federal government. It had limited enumerated powers. If the federal government wanted to ban alcohol, they needed a constitutional amendment to do that. If they wished to repeal that, they needed a constitutional amendment to do that. But what we started seeing in the 1960s and 1970s is people just doing away with the constitutional amendment. We'll just say the federal government can do that. We'll get the courts to say that it's constitutional under some wacky, weird, really tortured interpretation of the Constitution. We'll let interstate commerce mean, well, pretty much whatever anybody wants it to mean. We have court rulings that say the federal government can oversee interstate commerce that involves neither interstate or commerce. We have states basically just backing off and letting the federal government create agencies they're not legally authorized to. The Department of Energy, Department of Education, the EPA. And rather than looking and saying, is this a proper role for the federal government? If so, let's pass a constitutional amendment to enumerate the powers that they have. We just sat back and let them do it. So I'd say there is some correlation. We saw the seeds of the destruction of enumerated powers really begin planted early in the 1860s in the Reconstruction amendments because of trying to deal with this issue of how do we protect the rights of newly freed slaves. But that correlation I don't think is causation. I think it's much more likely that this was merely the excuse. See, once people saw that the federal government could be given power to oversee stuff in the states, well, then we realized, well, why should I bother trying to get, at the time, 40 some odd states to agree to this? I'll just get the federal government to do it. Well, how can I do that? Well, I'll just pass an amendment. People thought that alcohol was bad. Oh, so we'll pass an amendment. We'll grant the federal government the power. We're still dealing with enumerated powers, though. But it really was in the 1960s, and that's an important point. See, the 1960s is a couple full generations after the 1900s and 1910s, when not only do we see the government trying to assume more power through the amendments, but we start to see new methods of teaching Americans. See, before then, if you wanted your kids to go to school, you found a school and you sent them there. If the town wanted a school, they figured out how to come up with the money and buy the materials and pay a teacher, and they had a school. But in the 1910s, we saw this idea that, no, really, we have to have public schools and everybody has to go, and we'll let experts determine what people need to learn and when they need to learn it and how they need to learn it, and we'll put the experts in charge. And we saw that they stopped teaching them basic civics. They stopped teaching them about the Constitution. They stopped teaching them about rights that were maybe inconvenient or uncomfortable. Now, they're even avoiding teaching them about anything, a topic that might be considered offensive to someone. Now, I think we've got a correlation between 1865, 1910, and the 1970s. But I think more what happened is once people saw that they could get away with the federal government doing more, they did it. I don't think it was slavery per se that did it. I just think it happened to be the catalyst. Slavery isn't the cause. I think it just happened to be the catalyst. When they saw what they could do with the 14th Amendment, people who wanted to exercise power over others saw a method of doing that. And that was through the Constitutional Amendment. We see that exercised, and then when people started bypassing the Constitutional Amendment and got away with it, they figured out, why bother? Why go through all the work of trying to get a constitutional amendment if we can get it either through the courts or just federal law, because the people won't bother enforcing their own rights. They won't make us go through that. So we see, in my observations, are 1865, we went like this. In the 1910s, we went like this. In the 1970s, we went like that, the infamous hockey stick. So that's my point of view. What do you think? Was slavery the cause of the destruction of limited government in America? Were the seeds of our destruction planted right there at the beginning when we wouldn't deal with slavery? Or was slavery just an example of how people could manipulate the system to take power and to take control? Put your comments down below. Let me know what you think. I'm curious. I put out my opinion. I want to hear yours. I think if we do an honest study of history, we'll find a lot of correlation, but I don't see the true destruction of enumerated powers really until the 1970s. But hey, let me know what you think. Share this. Start a discussion. What do people think? Are we still, is the destruction of enumerated powers linked all the way back to slavery or not? And, head over to the website, Constitution Study. Hey, there's a quiz up there, constitutionstudy.com/quiz. Take the quiz, see how you do, see how well you understand the basic parts of the Constitution. Again, I hope to share this. I hope you'll invite me to come speak at your engagements. And I hope you'll come back here so we can discuss other topics the next time on the Constitution Study.